Hello everyone, today and in my following videos I'm going to show you how to really exploit the micro and low stakes. I'm going to provide you with examples that you can follow without any problem from any stake between NL2 and NL100. They tend to work even at higher stakes, you just need to be careful not to overdo it. In my coachings I provide game plans in about 10 sessions, where in the first 5 we focus more on theoretical concepts, but in the latter 5 we see a lot of exploitative strategies on turns and rivers and know all the lines where our opponents are playing badly. Let's look at one of these lines today. On the left you can see the GTO ranges, and on the right you can see our hand, which is pocket nines on the button, facing an open from the cutoff. Our cutoff opponent today is going to be a recreational player who is playing somewhat normal pre-flop ranges, but calling a little bit too wide against 3-bets. With the pocket nines we have two options. We could either cold call, which is possible strategy on the button, or we could just 3-bet our hand. We tend to prefer cold calling against small open sizes and when there are weak players left to act. Otherwise we just like to 3-bet more, so with our pocket nines, as you see on the left, we could do both. We could 3-bet or we could call. In this case we decide to 3-bet. GTO Wizard obviously tells us that this is a fine option, and in real life against this opponent I could also recommend you to 3-bet even wider with some of the hands that GTO Wizard is mixing, like the big offsuit hands among others. But now let's see some post-flop. Our opponent called the 3-bet and checks to us on the flop. The board is Jack 6-2 two-toned, so there's a flush draw. What do we do with pocket nines? The strategy on this board in these positions is a range c-betting strategy according to the range on the left. Red means the aggressive option, so betting. You see there's no green, so no check behind. Range c-bet is our strategy here. Now some people, they start to get a little bit fancy against recreational players and make up a few things, but what you need to know about range c-betting is that we range c-bet because we have the range advantage. We have much less very weak hands that our opponents on the cutoff does. So building a checking back range here, for example, doesn't really make too much sense. We'd need to include some hands in our checking back range, and if our opponents are passive on the turn, they, theoretically speaking, punish us and we lose EV compared to range c-betting. So careful about taking actions that are contrary to GTO if you don't really have a reason for this. Here we can just range c-bet. On the flush draw board, 1/3 is a better sizing. If this board was a rainbow board, so the same Jack 6-2 but 3 different colors, sizing up to 50% would be good. In 3-bet pots in position on rainbow boards, it makes more sense to size up. Contrarily to what some people still do today, sizing up on flush draw boards in these spots is the wrong strategic option. In our case with the pocket nines, we decided to c-bet for 1/3. And our opponent called against the c-bet. GTO Wizard is telling us that the 1/3 c-bet size is okay, despite not excluding a higher c-bet size even on this board at a low frequency. Now to the turn. The turn card is a 7 of diamonds, and our recreational opponent decided to donk against us. He used about 50% as a sizing, and of course recreational players donk much more frequently than regular players, and that GTO suggests. Now we have to decide what to do with pocket nines. If you look at the ranges on the left, you see that pocket nines are basically green, so theoretically speaking we have a call here. Now how does exploitative poker work? If we were in doubt whether pocket nines is decent to call or not to call, so we are in between fold and call, we need to figure out whether this donking strategy means stronger or weaker than GTO. If it means stronger, we could likely think about overfolding, but we also need to take into consideration what happens on the river, so it's a little bit more complex than this. But to our advantage here, donk betting by recreational players for this sizing means weaker than the theoretical sound donking range. So with our pocket nines, we are not thinking about going anywhere, we need to call against this bet. And as you can see by the EVs here, this is the correct option and anything else would be a mistake. However, in these rare lines where people start donking in spots where they really shouldn't, and especially against recreational players, keep in mind that the EVs in real life will be quite significantly different to what GTO Wizard is telling us here in this situation. So just for reference, theoretically speaking, this is a clear call, and in real life our opponent's range is going to be weaker, so even more a reason for us to call with this hand and not think about anything else. Now to the river, where things get a little bit more interesting. The river is a king of clubs, bringing an overcard to the board, and our recreational player decide to bet about 60% against us. We hold pocket nines here, and we have a bluff catcher. We need to decide whether we call or we fold in this situation. Before knowing the answer, what do you do in this spot? On the left you can see that pocket nines is mixed, so you see that there is green and blue, which means you could fold it or call. Theoretically speaking, you'd be looking at the suits, and GTO Wizard is telling us that, of course, when we hold the 9 of spades, we'd rather be folding, and without the 9 of spades, we'd rather be calling. But in real life, against recreational opponents, in lines that are completely different with completely different combos than GTO would use, so they have completely different hands than GTO, it doesn't matter as much to look at blockers. More importantly is to figure out whether our opponent here is likely to have bluffs or more bluffs than GTO, or whether he's likely going to have less bluffs than GTO. The way to find it out is by looking at data. So some people who have millions and millions of hands, they look at all of the lines and compare GTO frequencies to real life opponents' frequencies. So what does it mean to look at specific lines? We can't just look, do recreational players overbluff on rivers? Because every river situation is a different situation. We need to figure out what was the action before this river bet. We c-bet on the flop in the 3-bet pot in position, button against cutoff, and got called on the flop. On the turn he decided to donk, and to donk for 50%, as we also need to compare how people play with different bet sizes. Against the 50% donk on the turn, we already said that this is going to be weaker than it should in theory. But now, what if he bets again on the river for about 60%? Data tells us that when recreational players call against the c-bet, then donk for 50% on the turn and bet the river for about 50, 60, 70%, they overbluff significantly. This is typical for people who arrive to the river with too weak of a range, especially recreational players. Therefore, you should not do anything else but calling with any bluff catcher. A bluff catcher is a hand that is going to be behind his value, so what he considers to be a strong hand and bets because he has a strong hand, but is ahead of his bluffs, so it could be a lower pair that he's turning into a bluff, or just random air that recreational players also have, as they call too much against the 3-bet pre-flop. A last attention about the lines. So they're very sensitive to sizings. So even if we bet instead of 1/3, 2/3 or overbet on the flop, if they bet instead of 50% pot or overbet, the line could already be different. So some people could be overbluffing one size and underbluffing the other size. But on this line, with these sizings, you can be sure that the recreational player is overbluffing, and you can call with any bluff catcher, because against regulars in very frequent spot, just because they slightly overdo something, it doesn't mean that you have to max exploit them by always taking the exploitative line. But against recreational players, they can be max exploited. So whenever you have a reason to think that one action is better than the other, even if only by a little bit, you need to always take this action to be the most profitable you can. Exploiting recreational play as well is one of the most profitable things you can do. So of course we call the pocket nines here. GTO Wizard is telling us that this is fine, even though 0 EV, but if it was with a 9 of spades, they would have folded, and you can't take this EVs and ranges to the real life ranges as we're playing against a recreational player in a line that he plays completely different. If you want to see more lines in the next video, please leave a thumbs up. For all the lines, contact me for coaching. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.